What would you do if the only thing you had left was the one thing everyone told you was worthless? If you were handed a deed to a stretch of barren rock and told it was your inheritance, while the home your father built was taken to cover debts he never should have owed? For one young woman on the Arizona frontier, this was not a question, but the hard reality of a Tuesday afternoon under a sun that offered no sympathy. But the truth waiting in the heart of that forsaken cliff was a secret sealed in iron, a legacy of patience that would challenge a greedy man's power and prove that the most valuable things are not found, but earned. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Grace Whitaker and the claim everyone left for dead. Grace Whitaker stood motionless as the dust settled, her gaze fixed on the cabin door. It was a simple door, made of pine her father had felled and planed himself, but it was now a barrier more formidable than any canyon wall. Behind it was the clink of her mother's china being packed into a crate not her own, the scrape of her father's chair across the floorboards he had laid. Silas Croft, the agent for the Territorial Mining and Assay Office, stood on the porch, checking his pocket watch as if her life's dismantling was a train he couldn't afford to miss. His boots were polished to a black mirror, reflecting the distorted image of her own worn, scuffed leather. He cleared his throat, a dry, dismissive sound. "The company is sorry for your loss, Miss Whitaker. Truly. But your father's debts are a matter of record. The claim is played out. The assays show nothing but trace minerals. It's worthless rock. The cabin and its contents will cover a portion of what was owed." Grace's hands, calloused from work her father had taught her, mending tack, tending a garden in soil that fought back, panning for color in a creek that gave up nothing, clenched into fists at her sides. She remembered his hands, bigger and rougher than hers, holding up a single dull-looking stone one evening. "Patience, Gracie," he'd murmured, his voice full of a quiet fire. "This land doesn't give up its secrets easy. You can't bully it. You have to listen." He had listened for 10 years, and all it had gotten him was an early grave and a ledger full of red ink. Croft snapped his watch shut. "You have the deed to the claim itself, of course. A formality. You're free to prospect it to your heart's content." The words were a final, cruel twist of the knife. The land was hers, but the shelter, the water, the lifeblood of the place, was not. Two men hired by Croft carried out the last of her belongings: a small trunk of clothes and a canvas sack with a skillet, a bag of flour, and her father's worn Bible. They set them in the dirt beside her without a word. The door to the cabin clicked shut. The sound was deafening in the vast silence of the canyon. Croft tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good day, Miss Whitaker." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving her in a cloud of dust and ruin. She was 25 years old, alone, and the owner of nothing but a goat, a sack of flour, and a square mile of sun-baked rock that had already broken a stronger person than her. She turned her back on the cabin and looked up at the towering cliffs that marked the edge of her worthless inheritance, their red faces impassive in the afternoon light. A lone goat, Jasper, her father's last living gift, nudged her hand with his head, his bell giving a soft, mournful clank. That night, Grace made a cold camp at the base of the cliffs. The fire was small, more for company than for warmth, its embers pulsing like a fading heartbeat against the immense, star-dusted dark. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in from all sides. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the brittle scrub was magnified into a potential threat. Jasper slept nearby, his quiet breathing a small anchor in the overwhelming emptiness. The land felt ancient and indifferent, a place that had swallowed the hopes of countless people before her and would swallow countless more after. She had nothing, less than nothing. She had the memory of a home, which was a heavier burden than having no home at all. The next morning, as the sun began its relentless climb, she realized Jasper was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through her weary resignation. The goat was more than just an animal. He was a link, a stubborn, bearded piece of the life that had been stolen from her. She packed her few things and began to search, calling his name, her voice sounding thin and lost against the stone. She followed his tracks up a dry wash, the path growing steeper, forcing her to scramble over loose scree and around formidable boulders. The cliffs loomed over her, their sheer faces a geology of time and pressure. She was so focused on the tracks that she almost missed it. High above, on a ledge that seemed utterly inaccessible, Jasper stood silhouetted against the bright sky, calmly chewing on some unseen bit of vegetation. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by exasperation. As she craned her neck to plot a path up to the foolish animal, her eyes caught a flicker of light, a reflection that didn't belong. It wasn't mica or quartz. It was a hard, straight line of rusted metal set deep into the rock face, just below the ledge where Jasper stood. She shielded her eyes, squinting. It was a door. An iron door, square and grim, with a heavy pitted ring for a handle. There was no visible path to it, no trail, no steps carved into the stone. It was simply there, a man-made impossibility halfway to the sky, a secret kept by the indifferent rock. It made no sense. Why would anyone go to the trouble of hauling a heavy iron door up this cliff face and setting it into the stone? What could possibly be inside that was worth such a monumental effort? For the first time since Croft had ridden away, a feeling other than grief or despair stirred within her. It was a flicker of intense, burning curiosity. What secret could be worth sealing behind solid iron, halfway to the sky? Was this her father's final folly, or his hidden promise? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. Because what Grace was about to find inside wasn't just a discovery, it was a reckoning. To even attempt the climb, she needed tools she didn't have. Hope, however fragile, was a powerful motivator. Leaving Jasper to his precarious perch, Grace made her way back down the wash and began the long, hot walk to Dust Devil Creek, the small settlement that served the scattered ranches and failed prospectors of the region. The place was little more than a single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and a livery stable, all leaning against each other as if for support. As she approached, she could hear the boisterous sound of laughter spilling from the saloon's batwing doors. Peeking through the gap, she saw Silas Croft holding court at the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was recounting his latest acquisition. "The Whitaker Folly," he announced to the room, his voice slick with satisfaction. "Old man Whitaker chased a ghost for a decade and died with nothing but debt. I did the girl a favor, taking the cabin off her hands. A few men laughed with him, their loyalty bought with a round of drinks. Others just stared into their glasses, their silence a testament to a frontier code that valued minding one's own business above all else." Croft caught her eye through the swinging doors. A cruel smirk spread across his face. "Well, speak of the devil," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still haunting the rocks, Miss Whitaker? Looking for fairy gold?" The laughter that followed was sharper this time, edged with pity and scorn. Grace's face burned, but she held his gaze for a long moment before turning away. her silence a better reply than any words she could muster. She walked past the saloon and into the dusty quiet of the general store. The air inside smelled of coffee beans, leather, and salted pork. She bought a length of sturdy rope, a heavy-duty pry bar, and a small box of matches with the last of her coins. The storekeeper counted out her change without meeting her eye, his sympathy as useless as a dry well. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, a voice, dry and cracked as old parchment, spoke from the shadows of the porch overhang. Some doors guard what is precious. Grace turned to see an old woman named Elena, a local Tohono O'odham woman who had lived in these lands since before the town had a name. She was wrapped in a faded blanket despite the heat. Her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, she looked from the pry bar in Grace's hand to the distant cliffs. Others, she continued, her dark eyes holding a strange intensity, guard the person who is meant to find it. The words settled in the air, heavy and cryptic. Grace didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. Elena gave a slow, deliberate nod in return, as if a vital contract had just been sealed between them. As Grace walked away from the town, the whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. Poor girl's lost her mind, just like her father. Chasing ghosts in the canyons. The mockery stung, but Elena's words echoed louder, a strange counter-melody of purpose against the chorus of doubt. She was no longer just retrieving a goat. She was answering a call. The climb was a brutal conversation between her body and the rock. The sun beat down on her back, turning the cliff face into a griddle. The rope, coiled over her shoulder, and the iron pry bar, tucked into her belt, added an awkward, dangerous weight that threatened to pull her off balance with every move. Her hands, so already calloused, were quickly scraped raw on the sharp edges of the rock. She moved slowly, deliberately, testing each handhold and foothold before trusting it with her full weight. Dust filled her nostrils, sweat stung her eyes, and the silence was broken only by her own ragged breathing and the dislodging of small stones that rattled down the cliff below. She didn't look down. Looking down was a luxury she couldn't afford. She focused only on the next 3 feet of rock in front of her, a vertical world of cracks, ledges, and stubborn, sun-scorched brush. Jasper watched her progress from above, his occasional bleat a strange, lonely encouragement. After what felt like an eternity, her scraped fingers closed over the edge of the ledge. With a final, lung-burning effort, she hauled herself up and over, collapsing onto the narrow shelf of rock, her chest heaving. She lay there for a long minute, the rough stone cool against her cheek, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. When she finally pushed herself up, she was face to face with the door. Up close, it was even more formidable. Thick iron plates were riveted together. The entire structure set so perfectly into the rock it seemed to have grown there. A heavy, intricate lock, rusted solid, barred the way. There was no keyhole, only a solid face of metal suggesting a complex internal mechanism. It was a statement of permanence, a defiant seal against the world. For a moment, a doubt washed over her. The sheer impossibility of it was overwhelming. But then she thought of Croft's mocking smile, of the whispers in the town, of her father's tired, hopeful eyes. She would not be defeated by a door. She took the pry bar from her belt, finding a small gap between the iron frame and the rock. She wedged the tip in. She threw her entire weight against it. The bar bowed slightly, but the door didn't move. A groan of frustration escaped her lips. She tried again from a different angle, leveraging a small outcrop of rock for more power. The screech of metal on stone was a piercing shriek that echoed across the canyon. Sweat dripped from her brow, her arms screaming in protest. She worked for over an hour, a relentless cycle of leverage, pressure, and the agonizing sound of tortured metal. Finally, with a deafening crack that shot vibrations through the stone beneath her feet, the rusted locking bolt sheared off inside the frame. The door, freed from its long imprisonment, groaned open a few inches, releasing a puff of cool, stale air that smelled of deep earth, damp stone, and time itself. She pushed it the rest of the way open. It swung inward into absolute darkness. She retrieved her lantern and matches, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to strike a light. Holding the flickering flame aloft, she peered inside and stepped across the threshold, out of the blinding sun and into the quiet dark of the unknown. The lantern light pushed back the darkness in hesitant waves, revealing a space that was not a natural cave. The walls were roughly hewn but deliberately squared off, the chisel marks still visible in the stone. It was about the size of the cabin she had just lost, a chamber carved from the mountain's heart. Her first sweep of the light brought a wave of disappointment. It appeared to be nothing more than an old prospector's storage locker. Against the far wall stood a heavy wooden workbench, littered with rusted tools, a miner's pick, several drill bits, a heavy sledgehammer. Coils of brittle-looking rope hung from iron pegs driven into the stone, and a half-dozen empty wooden crates were stacked in a corner, covered in a thick blanket of dust. It felt like a place abandoned mid-task, a project started with ambition and ended in failure. Her father's folly, just as Croft had said. She felt a familiar hollowness in her chest, the bitter taste of hope turning to ash. She had risked her life climbing a cliff to find another man's forgotten junk pile. She set the lantern on the workbench and sank onto one of the crates, her body aching with fatigue. As she sat in the quiet, a sound began to separate itself from the silence. A steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the back of the chamber. Curious, she picked up the lantern and followed the sound. In the far corner, a thin, dark fissure snaked down the rock wall. From it, a single drop of water emerged, shimmered in the lantern light for a second, and fell with a soft splash into a shallow basin neatly carved into the stone floor. The basin was nearly full of clear, cold water. In this parched land, water was life. It was more precious than gold. To have a reliable, protected source like this was a treasure beyond measure. Her father hadn't been a fool to build up here. He had been a genius. This hidden spring could sustain a person indefinitely. The discovery sent a fresh current of energy through her. She began to look at the chamber not as a tomb of failure, but with new eyes. Her gaze fell back to the workbench. Tucked beneath a canvas sheet were several survey maps, weighted down at the corners with small, smooth river stones. She unrolled one. It wasn't a map of her father's claim. It depicted the entire valley, with the creeks, washes, and springs marked with meticulous, careful lines. Why would he have these? Why would he store them here, in this hidden place? As she was rolling the map back up, her hand brushed against the leg of the workbench. Her fingers traced over something carved into the wood. She held the lantern closer. It was a set of initials, deeply incised, R. Hale. Not her father's initials, J.W. for John Whitaker. Who was R. Hale? The name was a key to a lock she hadn't known existed, another layer to her father's secret. This was more than a storage room. It was a place of purpose. She just hadn't found it yet. Grace made the chamber her own. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of labor and discovery. She swept away the thick dust, organized the tools on the workbench, and used the old ropes to rig a pulley system, allowing her to haul her meager supplies up the cliff face without having to make the treacherous climb again and again. The chamber became a sanctuary, cool during the searing heat of the day and secure against the chill of the night. She slept on a bed of old canvas sacks, the steady drip of the spring a comforting lullaby. By day, she studied the maps, trying to decipher their meaning, her finger tracing the blue lines of waterways and the brown contours of the land. She felt closer to her father in this stone room than she ever had in the cabin below. This was his true legacy, a place of quiet, deliberate planning. One afternoon, as she was securing the iron door from the inside, a movement far below caught her eye. A rider was slowly making his way up the canyon, his path leading directly to the base of her cliff. He stopped, dismounted, and stared up, his gaze sweeping the rock face. Grace instinctively retreated into the shadows of the chamber, her heart pounding. Had Croft sent someone? The man shielded his eyes, looking directly up at her ledge. "Hello, the rocks!" he called out, his voice clear and strong, carrying easily in the still air. "Saw a light up there the last few nights. Figured I should see who my new neighbor is." His tone wasn't threatening. It was calm, curious. Grace remained silent, hidden in the dark. The man waited a patient moment. "Name's Robert Hale," he called again. "My ranch is just across the valley." R. Hale, the name from the workbench. This was no stranger. Taking a breath, Grace stepped out onto the ledge, squinting in the bright sunlight. The man below looked up, touching the brim of his hat. He had a weathered face, kind eyes, and the quiet, capable stillness of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. "I'm Grace Whitaker," she called down. "John Whitaker's daughter." A look of understanding, then sadness, passed over his face. "I was sorry to hear about your father," he said, his voice sincere. "He was a good man, a patient man." He paused. "He and I built that place you're in. He called it his strongbox in the mountain, said it was for safekeeping." He looked at her torn dress, the raw state of her hands. "Looks like you could use some help securing it." The next day, he returned with a mule loaded with supplies: lumber, fresh nails, a better lock, and a jar of salve for her hands. He didn't ask what she was doing there or question her right to the chamber. He simply saw a need and met it. They worked together in a comfortable silence, their movements synchronized by the shared task. He showed her how to properly brace the door frame with the new lumber, his large, competent hands guiding hers. He helped her deepen the water basin, their shovels striking a steady rhythm against the stone. Trust wasn't built with words between them, but with the quiet language of shared labor, mutual respect, and the simple act of showing up. A week passed. The chamber was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress. The new lock on the iron door was strong, the frame reinforced. Robert had helped her rig a small stovepipe through a fissure in the ceiling, allowing her to have a small, smokeless fire for cooking. He would come by every other day, bringing a bit of jerky or some fresh coffee, never staying long, never prying. He spoke of her father with a deep, quiet respect. He saw things other folks missed, Robert said one evening, staring into the small fire. He wasn't looking at the ground, Gracie. He was looking through it. He told me once this place had a heart, and he was determined to find it. His words lingered in the air after he left. This place had a heart. That night, as she was cleaning the stone floor, her hand brushed against a flagstone near the back wall that was slightly looser than the others. It was the only one that shifted under her weight. Recalling Robert's words, she fetched the pry bar. With some effort, she worked the tip of the bar under the edge of the stone and lifted. It came away with a grating sound, revealing a shallow, squared-off recess beneath it. And nestled inside that recess was a small tin box, heavy and sealed with wax. Her hands trembled as she carried the box to the workbench. This was it, the heart of the place. She carefully broke the wax seal and lifted the lid. The lantern light fell upon a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her father's dense, sloping handwriting. Beneath it were a half-dozen official-looking documents, folded neatly. She picked up the journal, its worn leather warm in her hands, and opened it to the first page. Robert sat across from her on a crate, silently sipping coffee, giving her the space she needed. The first entries were about the claim, his initial hopes, the back-breaking work of sinking the first shaft. Then the tone began to change. He wrote of his growing suspicion of Silas Croft, of assays that came back strangely low, of Croft's persistent, casual questions about his progress. "Croft watches me like a hawk," one entry read. "He thinks I'm a fool, but I see the greed in his eyes. He knows there's something here, but he wants to wait for me to fail so he can pick it up for pennies on the dollar." Then came the discovery, not on his claim, but under it. While exploring a deep fissure, he had broken through into an older, deeper network of volcanic tubes and found it. A thick, unmistakable vein of silver ore, rich with horn silver and argentite. A lode. He knew at once that if he announced it, Croft and his powerful company would find a way to take it from him. So he began a long, patient deception. He started building the chamber with Robert's help, a secret base of operations. He faked his prospecting reports, sending in worthless quartz samples for assay, all while secretly mapping the lode and planning a way to secure his rights without alerting Croft. The documents under the journal were the proof. Assay reports from a trusted assayer in another territory, showing ore so rich it was almost unbelievable. The maps suddenly made sense. They were his plans to secure the water rights from the hidden spring and plot a route to bring the ore out over the ridge, bypassing the town completely. He had been on the verge of filing his true claim when his heart had given out. Grace looked up from the journal, her eyes shining with tears. Her father hadn't been a failure. He hadn't been a fool chasing ghosts. He was a brilliant, patient strategist who had been outmaneuvering a predator. Croft hadn't just collected a debt on a worthless claim. He had knowingly and deliberately tried to steal a fortune. The knowledge settled in her, hot and hard as steel. The fight was no longer just for her survival. It was for her father's name. It was for justice. The knowledge was a weapon, but a dangerous one. Croft had the power, the influence, and the town in his pocket. A piece of paper meant nothing if she couldn't get it into the right hands. Robert understood immediately. "He can't know you found this," he said, his voice low and serious. "He's been watching the cliffs. He'll have seen our lights, seen me coming and going. He's getting nervous." His words proved prophetic. The next afternoon, they saw two men on horseback at the base of the canyon. Men Grace recognized as Croft's hard-faced employees. They weren't prospecting. They were watching, their presence a clear and silent threat. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, the weather turned. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled up over the western ridge, and the wind began to whip through the canyon with a low moan. A summer monsoon was coming, fast and violent. "We're not going anywhere tonight," Robert said, securing the heavy iron door and barring it from the inside. The storm broke with a sudden, furious clap of thunder that seemed to shake the mountain to its foundations. Rain came down in solid, deafening sheets, and lightning lit the chamber in stark, flickering flashes of white. Through a small crack in the door, Grace could see Croft's men taking shelter under a rocky overhang below, trapped by the deluge. They were all prisoners of the storm. The chamber, which had been a refuge, now felt like a cage. The storm raged outside, its fury a mirror of the turmoil inside Grace. She and Robert were trapped together, the immensity of her discovery and the danger they were impressing down on them. To fill the roaring silence, they talked. He told her about his late wife, how they had built their ranch from nothing, and the quiet, empty years after she was gone. He spoke of his time as an army scout, of learning to read the land, to trust its quiet signals. Grace, in turn, spoke of her father, not as the town saw him, but as she knew him, a quiet, gentle man with a core of unbending determination. In the flickering lantern light, surrounded by the storm's fury, the walls between them came down. They were two lonely people who had found an unlikely anchor in each other. A particularly violent crack of lightning struck the ridge just above them, followed by a deep, grinding roar. The ground shuddered. Robert immediately unbarred the door a crack to peer out. "Rockslide," he muttered, pulling it shut again. "Small one, but it's come down right over the path to the ledge. Nobody's getting up or down that way for a while." The storm had made their fortress a true prison, but it had also protected them. Croft's men were cut off. When the rain finally subsided hours later, leaving behind the clean, sharp smell of wet sage and ozone, a profound sense of calm settled in the chamber. The world outside felt washed clean, new. Robert looked at Grace, his expression clear and steady. "This was your father's," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "His discovery, his legacy. We'll see it right. Together." In that moment, the choice was made. It was no longer her fight alone. It was theirs. At the first light of dawn, Robert was already studying the back wall of the chamber. "Your father and I talked about a back way out," he said, running his hand over the stone. "An old fissure that connects to the scout trails over the ridge. He was planning to use it to bring in supplies without being seen." They found it behind a stack of old crates. A narrow, tight opening, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was their only chance. Packing the tin box with the journal and assays into a saddlebag, along with some water and food, they prepared to leave. Grace took one last look at the chamber, this stone womb that had sheltered her and given her back her father's legacy. Then, with Robert leading the way, they slipped into the tight darkness of the fissure. The passage was long and claustrophobic, but it opened out onto the far side of the ridge, a hidden world of pinyon pines and winding game trails, invisible from the valley below. Robert's horses were waiting in a small, hidden box canyon where he'd left them. They mounted and rode hard, not towards Dust Devil Creek, but east, towards the territorial capital. 2 days later, they walked into the federal land office, dusty and exhausted but resolute. The clerk, a man with a green eyeshade and an air of weary bureaucracy, was initially dismissive. Claims disputes were common, and the word of a powerful agent like Silas Croft carried weight. But as Grace carefully laid out her father's journal, the maps, and the notarized assay reports from the out-of-territory office, the clerk's demeanor began to change. He read the entries, his finger tracing the lines on the maps. He compared the claim numbers on Croft's official filings, which declared the land nearly worthless, with the staggering silver percentages on the reports from the tin box. The evidence was meticulous, damning, and undeniable. "This," the clerk said slowly, looking up at Grace with a newfound respect, "is fraud on a territorial scale." Word on the telegraph wire traveled faster than a horse. Within a week, a federal marshal rode into Dust Devil Creek. The townspeople gathered on the boardwalks, watching in stunned silence as the marshal, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, strode into the territorial mining office. He emerged minutes later with Silas Croft, whose face was pale, his usual arrogance completely gone. The community that had mocked Grace now watched her ride back into town alongside Robert Hale. She sat tall in the saddle, her expression not triumphant, but serene. They saw not a mad girl chasing ghosts, but a woman who had unearthed a truth they had all been blind to. Croft wasn't arrested on the spot. The marshal's investigation would be quiet and thorough, but his authority was broken. He was ordered to pack his bags, his license suspended, his reputation in ruins. As he loaded his wagon to leave town in disgrace, the whispers that followed him were not of pity, but of contempt. On the porch of the general store, Elena watched Grace pass. She didn't speak, but she raised a hand and gave a single, slow nod, her ancient eyes filled with a deep, knowing light. The door had guarded the one who was meant to find it, and in doing so, had revealed the true heart of the mountain. The sun was setting, painting the cliffs in strokes of gold and rose. Grace and Robert stood on the ledge outside the chamber door, the quiet of the evening settling around them like a soft blanket. In her hand, Grace held a new deed, properly filed and stamped with the seal of the territory, confirming her ownership of the Whitaker lode. There was no grand celebration, no cheering crowd. There was only a profound, earned peace. The land, once an adversary, a symbol of her loss, now felt like a partner. It had held her father's secret, and then it had held her, keeping her safe until she was strong enough to claim her birthright. Robert stood beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, still healing but strong, curled around his. His hand was rough and calloused, a mirror of her own, a hand that understood work, patience, and loyalty. "Your father would be proud, Grace," he said softly, his gaze on the vast, beautiful valley stretching out below them. She looked from the deed in her hand to the darkening horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. She thought of her father's decade of patient labor, of his faith in what he could not yet see, of the legacy he had so carefully hidden for her to find. She had won back more than a piece of land. She had reclaimed his honor and discovered her own strength in the process. "He wasn't just digging for silver," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, certain reverence. "He was building a foundation." The words hung in the still air, simple and true. It was a foundation of courage, of patience, of love, strong enough to build a future on, here, in the heart of the mountain. Thank you for joining us for this story of endurance and hidden worth. If you believe that patience is the deepest kind of strength, please leave a like and let us know your thoughts below. Subscribe for more tales from the frontier, where the greatest treasures are always buried the deepest.